Hey, my name is Kelsey. I use the she series of pronouns, and I am currently out in Maple Halls from my offices. So if you hear the beeping, I am next to a swipe in machine for the kids. Sorry about that. But I work out, I'm a counselor on staff, but I also work out in housing and residence life. So a real good look at what you guys are seeing with your students. So glad that Mary reached out and asked us to come.
Thanks, Kelsey. So we got reached out and asked to talk about some of the different adjustments and challenges that students are facing as they come back to campus, as they're dealing with like freshman transition, but also returning to campus maybe after COVID, if their first semester, first year was online, some different things. So really just talking about adjustment and transition in general. So we wanted to start off with a little bit of an interactive piece in here from you all. So if you wouldn't mind putting it in the chat, you can unmute whatever you're comfortable with. We want to hear from you. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced? And that could be either within the last like 18 months, that could be when adjusting to college. If you think back to then, to a new environment, a new job, maybe a big move. Okay, so that's like our first question. And we can kind of jump around with these. Second one is, what were some of the biggest stressors that you remember? What were the top priority items? And let's kind of focus with those two first before we go into the third one.
And I can give an example while people are talking in case you guys are typing and using the chat. So an example that I would give is that the last time I faced a big transition, not using a COVID reference because I feel like people are tired of that, but I moved, when I came to work at UNT 3 years ago, I moved from Colorado. The biggest challenge was, you guys have humidity here. What is this? And so one of the biggest stressors was figuring out, like, how do I adjust, you know, just my very basics of like, how do I feel comfortable in the area that I'm in? I have to change my wardrobe, and it all sounds so silly, but that was hugely stressful to me. Where's the nearest Walmart, stuff like that. So adjustments and stressors are really big. So that being an example, anybody else can think of some big stressors, some big challenges in a new environment.
I see one in the chat there, finding out where to park and where the buildings are. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, when I started at UNT, I was like, where are the best places to eat on campus? Like, I need some good options.
Challenges of imposter syndrome, adjusting to a new area environment, finding community and support, and asking for help. Ooh, such good ones.
I'm trying to think back to when I was a transfer student. I think it was August 2002 when I transferred here for my undergrad, and one of the biggest challenges was just finding a community, like friends, because even though I knew one or two people from high school, you know, they already had their set of friends. So I just had to step out of my comfort zone and like seek that out. And thinking about the stressor, I think it was such a big environment for me compared to the previous college that I attended. I went to like a small private university, and then going to a big state school was very like, whoa, there's a lot of things here and a lot of people. So just trying to like balance the largeness of UNT. Yeah. Like it was overwhelming at times.
That's what I hear from my students. They're like, there's so many ways to be involved. There's so many organizations, but also there's so many organizations. There's so many ways to be involved. And so they can kind of get stuck or frozen in that weird in-between span.
Mm-hmm. I also hear from my students, and I bet you guys are feeling it too, is that this year is different. Mm-hmm. There are so many more people. We've been on campus prior to COVID, and we've seen it at full capacity. We've seen it at when no one else is here and we're just here working in the screen. But I've never seen police have to direct traffic before. And that happened the first 2 weeks of school. Like, that's a huge adjustment. That's a huge stressor.
Mm-hmm. I've even had some like returning students who are like juniors. They were here when we were last in person for fall, but they're just talking about like, I don't remember there being this many people on campus. I don't remember there being like that packed in the union and having to wait in those lines. And so even if they had that prior experience, just like the year gap has been kind of a weird adjustment, kind of returning back.
That third question, like what are students facing currently? I think about our officer board, and most of them are pretty young, like 18 or 19, first or second year students. And I see that they're still trying to learn how to balance like a full course load and then starting a new organization, which that is ours. And then I know some of them have part-time jobs. So I think, I don't know, like I remember when I was at that age, like I was going 150 miles per hour and not knowing exactly when to like pull back. So I there's a lot of balls being tossed in the air for them. So
yeah, I think you guys have kind of nailed most of the things that we wanted to talk about here. You guys are crushing it. Let me go. Ooh, I jumped the gun a little bit. Oh no. Let me go back. Yeah. Okay. So kind of going through what are the big things that they're adjusting to? So we can kind of break it out into these couple different categories. And you'll see as we go through these that a lot of these are things that you all talked about and already mentioned. So a big kind of piece with that adjustment is this feeling of competence, right? Am I good enough? Do I fit in here? Can I make it at UNT? Am I going to make the grades? Am I going to be able to balance it all? Like, do I deserve to be here? So they mentioned in the chat imposter syndrome. Yeah, that's huge. And I think, again, when we think about some of those like new students who are coming in, well, maybe their senior year was remote, then it is like a vast transition to come from essentially being a junior to now a freshman in college and having to manage those like higher workloads with classes, all of those different pieces. The second area then is like that autonomy piece, which again, how do I like separate myself from my parents, from that family, that home environment, those connections, and kind of move into my own independent individual, right? Can I balance all of those things? So when you mentioned talking about like balancing working a part-time job, academics, being the leader in my organization, starting a new organization, having some time for fun in there, like how can I do it all? Can I do it all? Right. Third one there is that identity piece, which we know is huge for college students, right? When figuring out like who am I? Who do I want to be? What do I want to major in? Like, what do I envision for my college experience? It's all of those pieces kind of flow into that. And then this fourth area, which again, you all share it already, was like that relationship, connection, all of those different pieces. So can I make connections? Can I find my spot where I fit here? Can I find my group of friends? But then that extra level with that of like navigating some of those relational dynamics that come out. So like, how do they handle conflict when things don't go well in the organization? But really that's that overall understanding myself in context with others. And so again, when we think about, I feel like this year is especially unique because the past year and a half has been online for the most part. And so that is like a weird adjustment to then come back to be in person and have to re-navigate some of these things or just kind of readjust. That's what I'm seeing with a lot of my like older students. Yeah, I've done this before, but I'm kind of faced with a lot of these same issues now that I'm back in person. So they don't just leave after that freshman, sophomore year. We're seeing it even in grad students and some of our older upperclassmen as well. Kelsey, did I miss anything you want to add?
I think a common conversation I have with my students around these types of things is that not only is there questions around competence, autonomy, identity, and relationships, but there are messages in our world that are telling all of our students that they are supposed to do all of these things well in time. And so we're literally handing them 5 tasks, and much to what was brought up earlier is that some of them have part-time jobs and involvement on campus. This isn't even a conclusive list. And so when we hand them that work, now whether we are the ones telling them they're supposed to do it well or whether that hurt it, it's someplace else, or they made that up in their own brains, that's the pressure that they're operating underneath. It's not only can I make it, but can I make it well? Am I good enough? Can I balance everything, but can I balance it well? Who am I? Is that enough? Like playing into some of that depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome, and all the combinations of things. Just that underlying tone of not only are these topics, but there's that emphasis or that unspoken expectation that they're supposed to do these things well.
Yeah. That's not even in like throwing in that layer of social media pressure and things that are also happening as well, which that could be a whole other presentation that we could do. So we won't go there. But I want to say, like, what does this look like, right? So on this slide, I've got like what this can show up as we're working with our students. So a lot of the things when we talked about some of those stressors that our students are currently facing, it looks like this, right? So there's those difficulties just with that overall adjustment period. And so this brings up like changes in sleep, eating, exercise, technology. So that was my like weird way of putting social media in there of like, or gaming. I've had some students where they got real into different games and then didn't go to their classes because now I'm super invested in this. So just trying to figure out like that time management piece. How do they create a routine here that works for them without some of that built-in structure, right? And I think that's where we saw a lot of our students struggle over the past year of like the elimination of structure with remote classes, and you can do your class whenever and you don't have to go anywhere, you can stay in your room. But also kind of trouble getting back into the routine of that, of like what it looks like to have in-person organization meetings, what it looks like to host in-person events, doing some of those different pieces. You guys mentioned it earlier with like adjusting to a smaller or a larger campus or community. So trying to find your niche in such a like big, fast-paced environment can be really challenging. We kind of talked about this next one already with some of the difficulties with academics. I think that's one of the big one that comes to mind most often when we think about adjusting to college, right? So some of those same things with like getting out of a routine, not attending classes, difficulty maintaining that coursework load and keeping up with it. But I also see this like where they're taking general classes, right? So they're not quite in their major yet. And so I see a lot of disconnection there of like, well, this isn't really applicable to me. Like, I'm not going to use this in the future. So why am I doing this? It doesn't really matter, right? So we see some of that like disengagement with some of those things as well. A big one then is the difficulty with connection. I think we all can highlight that, especially over the past year and a half of just like these different changes within their support network. So that could be like losing friends who may be transferred. That could be losing the connection with family if I'm moving pretty far away from home. But then also that like second piece of finding that new fit here at UNT, feeling connected and engaged with folks in my organization and my involvement, some of those other pieces. I feel like we've hit juggling some of the multiple roles and demands pretty hard, so I won't stay too focused on that one. But I think another one that comes up for me is like how they're utilizing different coping skills, problem solving skills, right? So we're seeing a big reluctance to ask for help, right? So maybe I don't even know that I can get help. That's a big conversation I have with a lot of my students of like, they didn't know those resources were out there, that we could have support for that. And so I maybe don't know who to ask or that I can ask for this, right? So I kind of stay stuck in that little place. And that ties into the next one of not knowing about some of those available resources. The last one on here is just like navigating this overall stress and mental health concerns. So we know that most mental health concerns present between the ages of 14 and 24 for the first time. And so when we're thinking about our students, we're exactly in that age range, or maybe this is their first experience with anxiety or depression or another mental health concern, or maybe it's just elevated to a higher level where now it's more difficult to manage with everything else that's happening on top of it. So a lot of times this is their first experience. So navigating that, just another layer. Anything I missed, Kelsey?
I don't think so. Michelle, I saw you come on camera. Did you have a question or a comment? Okay. The thing that I'll say about this is that, I mean, it's just really, I mean, we can all read it. It's right there. But as far as like the challenging adjusting is that I do want to acknowledge you guys' role adjacent to this. You're watching them do this. And then a lot of times what I have to kind of gently call my students on is that they come in and they're like, I have all these things. And I'm like, yeah, I can see all those things, but I'm doing my best to help you. And I'm doing my best to figure out how to make this work. I can help you with this, but I'm not about to take that from you. You have to carry that and I get to help. And so I think just acknowledging again, you guys' relationship with these students as they're coming in, and that advisory piece of like, okay, I see this, it's great that I understand this, but I can't take that for you. We just have to learn how to carry it, and I get to learn how to help.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
So then in our next one, the impact of 2020, everyone take a deep breath. So we have that fatigue, right? We have that physical, emotional, that Zoom fatigue. And then we have this continued flexibility of at home, whether you're at work, at school, and then the world is continued flexibility. Up until 2020, I counted flexibility as a skill strength of mine. And now I count it as a weakness because sometimes it's overused or over offered. I don't know if that resonates with anybody else in the screen, but like being able to sit there and say like, I'm flexible. Maybe I shouldn't be, or like maybe I should have been a little more rigid. Maybe I let you run over me. Maybe I added too much to my plate to try to do somebody else a favor. That it's funny how that fatigue and that continued flexibility have reciprocal effects on each other. If I'm tired, it impacts my flexibility. If I'm overly flexible or under flexible, to be fair, it impacts that fatigue and back and forth. It's like a nice little pendulum there. And so really the impact of that 2020, what I learned a lot of things from 2020, but basically what I learned is that now that I'm aware of it, I'm aware that I'm messy. I'm aware that people around me are messy. So now what do we do that we're aware of it? We have to acknowledge that physical, emotional, that Zoom fatigue. My kids don't want to be in the screen anymore, but sometimes that's all I can give them, or sometimes it's what their schedules allow, or vice versa. They don't want to be in person, but that's what I can give you. Same with coming back to work, that continued flexibility, things that are happening in the world, just how that swings back and forth, and the impact of that. Again, learned a lot, but now that we're all aware of how messy we all are, how do we carry that forward? How do we do that for each other? And not sacrifice things along the way, at least too much of things.
Yep. I think we've seen that like shift as we return of like COVID's over, like it's done, like we're not there anymore. And so we see that push to like return to in person, and almost that like overcommitment with some of our students of like, I want to do everything in person all the time. We're gonna have all the events. And then again, we have to help balance that out of like, let's not go too far.
There was also something to be said for like, and this draws into here, these top 5 impacts too, of like the joke I made with my supervisor and some of our staff members, Melissa included, is that like, I feel like an on-demand service at this point. And so when you start talking about those top 5 impacts of that stress, anxiety, this disappointment or sadness, loneliness and isolation, financial setbacks, relocations, all of those were then kind of put in this little box where like, okay, cool, you go here for this, you go here for this, you go here for that. And I feel like an on-demand service sometimes. And so it's like when pulling in a little bit of that flexibility, when you're talking to people about their stress and anxiety, their disappointment, their sadness, their financial setbacks, some of that flexibility becomes tricky. How hard do I be on this? How much do I address the disappointment and the sadness? What are the financial setbacks? How much do I address the relocation? So being that the way that our world worked for so long made us this ready to respond, ready to be there, I'm always available culture. And now like snap back out of that. And so these top 5 impacts here with this stress and anxiety and all these different things, like we were supposed to work with it one way when we were in screens, and now we're expected to work with it other ways. How do we do that? Melissa, what else is on here for us?
So this is from, oh man, it's like click happy here. So this is from a survey that they did where they actually asked direct students of like, what's been the most stressful part of the past year for them. And you can kind of see kind of the ratings on those of what those pieces are, which again align with what you all shared for like your experience when addressing change, when adjusting to new transitions, some of those different pieces that we've highlighted again with like what our students are going through, what their experiences. So this is just more information for you all to see this. And I do want to recognize, I know Kelsey mentioned it earlier too, but I know when I was putting together this presentation, I was like, oh man, I'm feeling this too. So I also want to recognize that like double role that you all share of like, yes, I'm working with students who are experiencing these stressors and this ongoing adjustments, but like recognizing that elephant in the room, we're also going through these adjustments and transitions as well. And so as we move forward, yes, we're going to give you some strategies and some things that'll be helpful for working with your students, but also like feel free, pick some of those out and what can you use as well as we go through this too.
I'll also say that before she moves away from before you move away from that slide, the title up there says, what's been the most stressful, if anything, for you during COVID-19. When you look at the things on the side that the little bars come out of, those exist outside of COVID-19 too. You're dealing with students, and students go through this all the time of like feeling disconnected from the loved ones. Going through all of these things, the fearing that the loved one will contract COVID, just fearing that anything will happen to a loved one. We feel that, they feel that inside or outside of a pandemic. And so while the graph and then the presentation does specifically say that, because that's kind of been our world for a little while, I do want to express that the understanding that like these things also exist just in general.
Okay. So what can we offer our students? Some of the same things that we're offering you all today is just validation, also of like their experience, right? That we hear them, that we get them. So our goal with providing you all of that background information, which I know probably wasn't a shocker for a lot of those pieces, but was just to give you kind of that insight so we can validate their experiences, that we know that they're not the only ones experiencing this, right? That we've seen this trends nationwide with students. We're seeing it with all of our students that are coming in with counseling needs, but we're also experiencing it ourselves and in our personal life with those people that we interact with outside of work as well. We're also going to go through like what are some coping skills and strategies. So that was the thing that was highlighted earlier, some of those challenges to transition of like not knowing where to go for help, not knowing what resources are available, but also like some of the coping strategies that I maybe had in high school or last year in COVID look a little bit different with how the world looks now, look a little bit different with managing everything back in person again. So maybe I need to make some adjustments with some of those pieces, boundaries. We're going to talk about that. I know that was mentioned earlier, but some of those other things. And the last piece, again, just connecting to some of those resources. We're going to give you a few here today. I know you all know a lot of our resources, but I want to highlight a couple of those big ones. We've got this kind of on a continuum here of like, let's make it step by step. Let's make it a little bit easier. So you're going to see this slide a couple of times, but really it gives an overview of kind of our focus from here of like, how do we notice some of those changes in our students? How can we identify some of their needs? Check in with our students, encourage that boundaries, that self-care piece, giving additional resources, and then following up and continuing that conversation, because we know it just doesn't stop with that one and done kind of fix. How do we continue to support our students as new challenges arrive, as new transition issues pop up? Where do we go from here? All right, Kelsey, do you want to take it away with noticing some of the changes?
Yeah. So here's a nice little pretty graph of a wellness continuum, right? And so we have here on our far side over here, irreversible disability or death, moving to chronic illness, signs of illness, or that neutral space right there in the middle, that real pretty green. Signs of health and wellness, improved health and wellness, and optimal wellness. Now, what I want to point out about a continuum is that you are allowed to move up and down the continuum at different parts of your life, right? So what you identify yourself of like where you are or where a student tells you that they're at that day can change, and it can depend on the situation. And that wellness continuum is where we want to check on people like, how was your day? But like giving them actual space to answer. And then when someone asks how your day is, or trying to evaluate, like, are you really asking? Or like, are we just here to like kind of exchange pleasantries? Like, are we checking on each other? Like, what are we doing here? So being really intentional with how we use this, checking on students, noticing differences, okay? So when we start to notice those differences and we start to see that a student may be sliding upward, backwards, or even sliding into neutral on a wellness continuum is a sign that like things are happening, right? If somebody starts to improve, as humans, we move towards them. We're like, I want to know what's going on with you. Like things are going great. Okay, awesome. When people slide into that downward area of the continuum where things are not going well, again, the compassionate people inside of us, you guys are advisors for students. We assume that somewhere in there, the care for people is there, and that's why you do the job that you do. And so again, as people, we go into this area like, oh, how can we help you? What's going on? What's not working? What can we fix? That type of thing. It's really what I want to point out here, and is this circle around neutral here. That's a huge sign for people. When people shift into neutral, when things aren't going blazingly well, or when things are in flames, we tend to forget about those students in neutral, and not forget about them as in they don't matter, but like we tend to take them off our radar as far as like, we don't need to keep pushing you forward, but we don't need to drag you out of this yucky hole. Like the neutral kids kind of fall flat. And I'll be honest, the neutral kids on my caseload are the ones that I ask the most questions, because I want to know kind of where you're really at, what's going on, where are you, what's working for you, what's not. To truly sit in neutral is a huge skill. And so some of us do it on accident. And so how do we recognize and give them credit for that? But also how do we make sure that they continue forward or don't fall backwards, help them stay in that area? And so just pointing out that, again, as humans, we tend to move towards like leaning in and being excited for people whenever they're on that positive wellness continuum. And then, you know, rushing to their side and helping them whenever they're on that negative side, but also making sure that we leave space for those people in the middle. Because if we're honest, those people could swing either way. And so how do we prevent that? How do we make sure that they're still on our radar? And that's where we start to notice changes. As far as like, we moved from here to here, we moved from here to there. What are we doing with this? And just really being conscious of where they're at. It helps to kind of look at it in a spatial area like this.
I bring this up too, because I know a lot of our student leaders are like super high achieving, high performers. They're very involved. And so they're really good at like masking some of the struggles that they're facing, right? And so we might not necessarily always see them. So it's good to see this on a continuum, to see like, where are they when they're at their best versus maybe where they're struggling looks a little bit different than another student struggling as well.
And a lot of times in that surviving stage right there, the worried, nervous, irritable, sad, trouble sleeping, distracted, withdrawn, those are harder to pick up on than the depressed, tired, poor performance. Like we notice those things. We notice the positive. We notice this crisis, the struggling. The surviving piece is that really middle. That withdrawn one is one that I see quite a bit, is because we kind of, I call it turtle shelling, like, or hermit crabbing. Like we kind of go into our little area and we stay there and we do what we can to keep ourselves safe. But that also means that we tend to take ourselves out of view of the people around us, or out of view of the people who are supporting us. I tell my supervisor all the time, is one of the first things that I told her when we started working together was, when I'm not okay, this is what I do. I hermit crab, I hermit shell, I will withdraw, I will pull away and just kind of take care of business in my own little corner. That's when you need to pay attention, because that's when we're starting to kind of switch. And so that surviving can be really hard for people to recognize too, because it's not as indicative as some of the positive or negative crisis looking areas.
Okay. So then the next piece is identifying their needs with that. So we did the wellness continuum, but we also have that stress continuum. And I think this is, unfortunately, it had been like the picture of what we see right now. Right. And so I do want to recognize that there is positive stress, right? There's that stress that helps me like get my job done. I'm knocking out notes left and right, whatever that may look like for you. Then there's that shift into that general stress, into more of the chronic stress, which can lead to like that crisis piece. And so we bring this up because I feel like right now we're living in a very like stress culture. So that's the number one thing that I hear from students, like, oh, I'm just stressed. Like that's been kind of considered the norm, right? Of like, you're supposed to be stressed, you're in college, right? But that can be a little bit dangerous sometimes. So these are some of the signs of stress. I know you all are familiar with this and kind of have a good understanding of what this looks like. We try to give, excuse me, a good range of symptoms, because some of the ones that we hear are maybe some of these like emotional symptoms or cognitive symptoms or physical symptoms that maybe go under the radar or mentioned in passing. Like, I just really have a bad headache, just not feeling very well, just different things like that. Nervous habits, so like kind of the fidgeting, different things like that. So we wanted to give like an overview of this. But again, why we bring that up is when we think about stress, right? And now our stress culture is, and then we think about like mental health concerns, right? So remember, this is the big age when we're starting to see more mental health concerns come out for the first time. These things that I have bolded here are then those overlaps between stress and common signs of mental health. Okay, so I mean, we could honestly bold this entire slide if we wanted to get real specific, but I think about some of those things, again, we normalize that stress response, but it frequently can overlap and be indicative of maybe something else. Maybe we need some additional support, maybe some additional things that are happening. So we need to respond to those. How can we support students when we see some of these overlapping pieces? Okay, so these common signs, they're all by no means all exclusive, like all encompassing, any of those things. There's a lot of things that are probably missing on here, but again, just wanting to give you a big overview of just some general ones that kind of go across anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns as well. All right, you want to do this part, Kelsey?
Yeah, so checking in with our students. Listening with your ears, giving you a little acronym here. EARS is empathize, acknowledge, refer, and self-check. Okay, so when you go through and we're empathizing, when we're working with students, again, calling on your compassion card, right? You guys are in the role that you are in because we picked this. This is something we're drawn to for whatever reason. We like this style of work, or we like working with this organization, these students. And so some of that comes by naturally of being able to empathize and say like, yeah, I have this passion too, or yeah, this is important to me. So we have some combined interests. But it's also something that we try to call upon people to recognize that there is a difference in the situation that you're in as an advisor than the students are in as participants or as student or leaders, like these types of things. And that empathy can really go both ways. Sometimes we have to sit there and put boundaries on people or step in and take over. Sometimes they don't want us to do that, whether that's an advisor student role or student advisor role. It kind of just, and that little dance happens sometimes. And so making sure that that empathy goes both ways, not only towards the passion that you guys hold together and that you share, but also in the differences of approach. And so that empathy is necessary when you guys are paying respects to what your job titles are or leader titles are and figuring out what your roles are with that. Having that underlying empathy of, I know what you're up against and I know what you're trying to accomplish. I feel you on that. And then following it with what we have to do after that, whether that's push forward or pull back or put some boundaries, whatever it is. But that empathy piece of, I see you, I see what you're trying to accomplish, I see where your passions lie. All of that's extremely important to offer first. If we don't feel heard on either end as an advisor or as a student, we're not really going to get a lot of places. That frustration is going to breed from the very beginning. Then we acknowledge what's in front of us, right? So I gave that example of like, I hear you, I know that you want to go this direction, but we can't do it because of X, Y, and Z. And so feeling heard and acknowledged is huge. Yes, Michelle. And so that combination is just so important of like, when you're offering of like, I hear you, I understand, and I acknowledge that the next step is this, or I acknowledge what you're asking for is this. I acknowledge your needs or wants are this. And so those pieces really go in tandem. And so that empathize, that acknowledge, you understand, you're building that rapport, for lack of a better phrase. As therapists, we use that and we're like, I get it. This is coming through really clear. But without asking you guys to step into a therapizing role, being able to say like, it still is a human to human, I get this. I empathize and I acknowledge what's in front of us. You can use those terms, or you can use typical human terms of like, I get that, but like, here's what we have to do. And understanding that like, even just offering both pieces is extremely important. We can't just say, oh, that I see where you're going with that and end. We also don't want to just say, but we need to do this. And so having that gentle softball of like 1-2 punch there really helps with the empathize and acknowledge. Then you refer. If it's referral to something within your skill set, within your job role, within your wheel of duties, you can refer them to yourself or whatever resources you have available within your organization. You can also refer outwards if that's important or if that's appropriate, depending on what the situation is. But a lot of times referrals are like, have this air about them that you're taking something from inside an organization and reaching outwards. You're allowed to refer within different things. I'm assuming that there's multiple students in that organization. You guys have different strengths. You can refer one student leader to another student leader and say, hey, I bet that they have like some thoughts on that, or maybe they might be able to help. By accident, you're also acknowledging and empathizing that they might also need some help. And so it kind of starts to build each other on that, right? And so pointing out the idea that figuring out not necessarily a solve, but a next step with that refer is really important. And so again, that refer can be within that little body that you guys are operating within, or it can be a referral to an outside support for like more in-depth or more generalized support. It kind of depends on the situation. But these things start to fold in on each other and play on each other. The last thing is allowing a self-check. Melissa promised you guys that we would give you strategies that not only worked for your students, but also worked for you. You're allowed to check on yourself after using your ears. In fact, we encourage it very strongly. Like, okay, did that go well? Do I feel good about that? Melissa and I consult on some cases where, I'll call her and be like, I do not feel good about how that went. What do we think we need to do next? Like, what do we feel? I don't feel safe about this, this, and this. What are some follow-up steps? And I went through the EAR of ears and I did all the things, but it still doesn't feel good. That check deserves validation, and on both sides. Before the student leader leaves your office, do you feel good about the plan that we made? Do you feel good about the referral that we feel? Okay, great. I have some questions about this. We'll follow up on that later. Consulting with a colleague after that student leaves or after that organization takes place, and being able to say, like, this went okay. Checking in with yourself if a colleague's not available, and taking notes if you can about what felt good and what didn't. That way we can kind of visit and revisit and make a pattern out of listening with our ears. Whenever we're talking about how we do this, I gave some examples of how you can conversate and how you can start those back and forth, that dialogue with people. Then opening, using phrases like it sounds like, or it seems as if, or I hear you saying, all the ones that follow that. Notice how it pulls you and them into the conversation. I'm here with you. Okay. And so being able to say, like, it seems as if I took in enough information to notice a pattern or notice a need or whatever it was. And so you're not just pointing it out and being like, there's that thing. Like, you're there with them. So that opening of it sounds like, it feels as though I get a sense that like you are involved in that, which pulls in that empathizing piece and that acknowledgement piece as well, because you're confirming to them that you listen and that you are trying to respond adequately. When you include a feeling like sad, mad, alone, confused, frustrated, overwhelmed, you're providing some of that validation as well, some of that acknowledgement of what, as well as what might be happening either between you guys on their end, on your end. Those feelings are something that we can't deny. We can't be told we're wrong about feeling something. And so by carrying forward with a feeling, it helps draw that relatedness when in that conversation. It helps draw that connectedness too, of like, yeah, I know what feeling sad is like. I know what feeling alone is like. And so, okay, I can relate to that. I can connect to that. And then when you use that actual connector of supporting reasons, of listing like why, when, about, because, and then connecting it to that thought of like, here's the situation that's giving me this information. Here's the action or the behavior that's giving me this information. So going through that step by step, shimmying through that and putting it all together, it sounds like you feel really confused about my instructions because I'm seeing this look on your face and you're taking like notes really furiously. So like, where can I step back and like try to figure out a better connector for that? Or where can I clarify some things? And so, but you went point by point by point through this opening, feeling, connector, thought. Another one would be like, it feels as though like things are really working for you because you're presenting really confident, you're presenting really big high success rates for this event or for this organization. You feel really at home in your role. These can be positive things too. And so being able to rely on that structure of not only using our ears, but using those conversation starters of having an opening, inserting a feeling that exists between that interaction, having that connector, and then having that thought or that explanation really kind of carries things all the way through.
All right. So the next piece, again, this is boundaries and self-care is one of those ones that Kelsey and I could talk about all day. Like we love talking about boundaries and self-care. It could be its own presentation in and of itself. But I think this is especially important for our students who are involved, because this is where a lot of times we see either that like over commitment or that over involvement or difficulty with some of that time management and how do I set boundaries between like what I can do for the organization, what I have to get done for classes, and maybe what I'd like to get done outside, right? So we see this difficulty with like prioritizing some of these things, spending way too much time on social media, some of those other things that we already discussed. So again, boundaries are in and of itself a form of self-care. And so that's one of the big things that I emphasize to a lot of my students of like, having some of these things in place can protect your time and be really, really valuable and take care of your own mental health, your own overwhelm, all of these challenges that we've already mentioned. So again, boundaries, kind of some definitions on here. What I think about is naming some of those non-negotiables, right? So that's kind of the structure that I go through with a lot of my clients and a lot of my students is there are some things that like we have to do as people, right? We have to be sleeping, we have to be eating, we have to do some of those things. Those are those non-negotiables that are going to be staples in my day. But we have other pieces that feel pretty non-negotiable that maybe are a little bit negotiable, right? So also talking with like, what are those things that I can maybe say yes or no to, right? And take off of my plate to protect some of my time and some of my choices. I have a lot of students that say yes to everything. And then after they're like, I don't know why I said yes to that. I really don't have time for this. I really can't commit to that, but I'm already in it now. And so talking them through like, how do you back out of maybe a commitment that you've already engaged in? How do you maybe get some assistance from other people within your organization for some of these events? Really encourage them, like they don't have to take it all on themselves, right? So I see that pattern a lot of times with our student leaders. So just thinking of some of those as well. Again, I could talk on all day about this, but I do want to watch our time together. So how do we set boundaries? This is just a really easy example that I use with a lot of my students of identifying those limits. So identifying some of those areas where they're feeling stressed. So going back to the stress warning signs, some of those things that we identified earlier of like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Maybe my heart's racing. I have headaches when I'm working on some of these things. A lot of times our body gives us clues that like we've reached our limit and something has to change here because I'm maxed out, right? Or this is causing that physical, it's taking that physical toll on us, right? So the next piece then is saying like what I need, right? So I felt overwhelmed when I said yes to this event because I was really excited in the moment, but like it's too much now. What I need is to maybe back out of that commitment or do this other part, or can I not do this event and I'll help with another one in the spring, whatever that might be. I really encourage like keeping it really, really simple. Because a lot of times we have our students go into like these long explanations, right? But let's stick short, simple, doesn't have to be a big thing, right? This can also be in place if like cutting out some of that toxicity. So like not to harp on social media a lot, but it is what we consume and what our students are consuming. And sometimes that impacts then how they're experiencing and navigating things on campus. So maybe they need to set a boundary with a specific person who's not supporting them, doing some of those things. So when that comes in mind, I always think about like setting some of those consequences. So like if you continue to not listen to me or not support me, then I'm going to have to go a different route. I'm going to have to seek support elsewhere. I'm not going to answer your text immediately. I'm not going to respond. Like some of those other pieces that we put in place, again, protecting their time, their boundaries, some of those different areas. And the last piece is just repeating it. I think that's something that gets really frustrating for some of my students of, I set this boundary and they didn't respect it. I did the consequences and they still didn't respect it. A lot of times it's relearning a new habit. It's setting a new structure in a relationship in an environment, some of those places. And it's going to take practice. It's going to take a couple times before it is respected and in place. And so kind of just normalizing and validating that process as well of like, it's not going to be a one set boundary, everything solved kind of solution. But it is a process, right? And so with practice, we keep doing it. Things will be different and change will occur.
What I encourage my students to remember is that you are adjusting and so is the other person. And so that repetition, yes, is effort on your part. And yes, it is annoying at times, but very necessary, because not only are you the one making changes, but the person that you're making those changes in front of or towards is also having to adjust. And so what grace, space, whatever it is you want to call it, like if you give them the acknowledgement of like you're adjusting to, it tends to shake some of that yuckiness off of having to repeat. I didn't say it made it easier or better. I just said that it might shake some of the yuckiness off of having to repeat.
Mm-hmm. This next piece is making self-care a priority. And I know that can feel, the big thing I get is like, I don't have time for that. It's not going to fit my schedule. I have too much already. And so really being almost pretty intentional with what does it mean for self-care? And again, self-care can be setting boundaries. Self-care can be focusing on like, what type of environment do I need to like go to when I return to my room on campus? Do I need like kind of a calm environment? Do I need like a chaotic environment? Does noise, how does that impact some of those things? Thinking about like what type of movement needs you have. So we mentioned some of those like physical experiences of stress and mental health concern. Maybe I do need some movement. Maybe I've been sitting in the same place for a really long time and I'm just hitting a wall. So how can we check in with some of those movement pieces? Same thing with some of those physical needs. I always tell my students, like, let's go back to the basics. Like, have you drinking any water today? And I'm surprised every time I'm like, you know what? No, I haven't. Right. So some of those little things that we can do, making sure we're getting some of those non-negotiable needs met that sometimes get bumped off the list with like, I'm going to stay up really late to complete this. I'm going to skip this meal to go and get this assignment done or whatever that may be. But then also focusing on like what type of support I need from not only my peers, but also my supervisors or my leadership team, my exec board of my organization. We know we have some big time periods within each organization that are high events, high engagement, high interaction, and that takes a toll on our leaders specifically. So are there different things? Can we help them with delegating different tasks? Can we help them with pulling in some other members to do different pieces so it doesn't have to feel like it lands all on their shoulders? We know our student leaders are going to pick up the slack, but unfortunately then they pick up the slack and they take that toll on themselves. So anything that we can help, again, getting them support from their peers and from others is huge.
Self-care can also, being a priority, can also be celebrating you guys' wins. Mm-hmm. You guys do really great things. Part of self-care isn't just being like, great, pat on back, move to the next thing. Like it's a throw a party, figuratively or literally, whatever fits into your stuff. But like being able to take time and acknowledge that you guys crushed something huge or that you accomplished something really, really big, or that they did a great job on something really, really small. There's your self-care too.
Yep. It can also be just incorporated into your meetings already. So doing different activities together, like Kelsey mentioned, some team building things can be really huge. Recognizing those busy times in the semester. So I lead a group, purposely end it like 2 weeks before finals because I know they're going to be very, very stressed out. And like, let's not add one more thing on your plate. Let's take something off during those peak times. So recognizing some of those things can be huge as well. I'm a big fan of making a plan. Because I think what happens is when we don't plan and we don't have an idea, then we kind of get stuck and nothing happens, right? So getting really specific about like, what are some of those things that I need? Because I think, again, in the moment, I can't necessarily think of some of those things. I've done this with different organizations where we kind of share those stress and warning signs plans as like an exec board together, so that I know how to identify when my peers are stressed, what that looks like, and maybe what I could do to support them. right? So having, again, pulling on that like interaction, that connection piece across exec boards, across your leadership team, whatever that may look like. Engaging in that end of the day, beginning of the day self-check. So that could be attached to like the day, but also to different meetings, different events. How do we want to support and consult with folks as well? And then again, encouraging carving out those small moments for some of that stress management, those self-care practices. I've had my students create like, what's a playlist of your favorite songs that just get you in a good mood? Like they're just good vibes kind of playlist, playing that on your way to class, getting some of those music in, getting some of those movement in of walking maybe a few farther steps if I had to park farther away, just building some of those pieces into your daily routine. So I don't have to think about it. It's not something I have to do extra. It's just a part of what I'm already going through. And then the last piece here is referring to some of those additional resources. Of course, we're going to do a plug for counseling and testing. We do have our 24/7 protocol line, which is available where they can speak with a live counselor immediately by calling our main number and pressing 1. If they're interested in setting up an appointment, they can press 2 at that same number to talk with our front desk. The 3 other big resources that we have within counseling and testing that I always want to emphasize is TAO, which has some self-help modules, therapy assisted online. It's free with their UNT student email account. They have like meditation, mindfulness practices, different things like that on there. Ties into our 10-Minute Mind, which is a free partnership we have right now going with 10-Minute Mind. So they get notifications, again, walking them through the different mindfulness meditation practices. And then also reminding them of the Healthiest You app. So if they have UNT student health insurance, then they do qualify for free mental health counseling, medical services as well through the Healthiest You app. And so that's a big resource. If they need to get in sooner than maybe we can at counseling and testing, that's a really good option as well. Of course, I know you all are familiar with like the Dean of Students. So if you're seeing some of those warning signs, you're seeing a student that's struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out to them, and you can submit a care team report or a Seeking Options and Solutions report. Either one, they'll get them taken care of. So if you're unsure, that's okay. Of course, we have the Student Health and Wellness Center as well. Again, that's where we see a lot of our students come in with some of those physical complaints. So that's why I bring that up. And then also the Office of Disability Access for if they need additional accommodation support. Again, how can we support our students so that they can be successful as a student, but also as a leader as well. The last piece on here that we wanted to emphasize again is just following up and continuing that conversation. Again, we know that it's on that continuum, and so there might be time periods where students are really struggling and times where they're really thriving and doing really well. And so this isn't just a one and done kind of thing. It's an ongoing conversation and check-in and adjustment process. I think that's one of the things my students probably don't want to hear that I talk about a lot is like, it is a process, all right? But we'll figure it out. And so if this doesn't work, we have other options. We can kind of keep going and figuring that out.